Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody, depending on where you are in the world. My name is Kathy Cummings. I'm the Executive Director of the International Alliance of ALS MND Associations, and I want to welcome you to our webinar today on children, youth, and ALS MND. We have a fantastic panel with Melinda Cavanaugh, Marcela Santos, and Laura Willix, who are going to tackle this very interesting and difficult topic for our ALS MND community. I want to thank our sponsor Biogen, who has made this webinar series possible this year, before turning the microphone over to Melinda, who will moderate this webinar for us today. And Melinda, would you like to introduce yourself and your fellow panelists? Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you, Kathy, and thank everybody on this call listening in now or watching it once it's been recorded. My name is Melinda Cavanaugh, and I'm an associate professor in social work at the University of Wisconsin in Milwaukee in the United States. I have been a licensed clinical social worker for over 20 years, and I am also a researcher really addressing the impact of neurological disorders on children and youth, and primarily looking at the role children and youth play as caregivers in families with ALS. It's an absolute honor to be here, and it's an even larger honor to introduce my wonderful panelists. Marcela.
Hi, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. I'm Marcela Santos. I'm a licensed psychologist with a master's in social inclusion and disability. I have a personal experience with ALS because my dad had ALS for 16 years, and I was a child when he was diagnosed. I was 14 years old. So hopefully today I can give you a little bit of feedback of how that was. I'm also the volunteer psychologist at the ALS Association here in Colombia. So I have treated a lot of children of PALS and CALS, and yeah, I've seen the whole experience going on and the difficulty it has been. So it's great to be here. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Marcela. Laura?
Thank you, Melinda and Marcela. As they all said, good morning or good evening, wherever you may be. I'm Laura Willix, and I'm the Children and Young Persons Service Development Manager for the MND Association in the United Kingdom. My role at the association has been to identify needs of families affected by MND. That will include children up to the age of 25, and to actively grow the programme to find out what their needs are and how we as a community can help address, support, guide and grow our projects to meet these needs. So I'm really honoured to be here and be part of this panel, and this is such an important discussion topic that sometimes can be forgotten and missed in the world of MND. So thank you.
Excellent. I think everyone listening to this presentation is really in for just some extraordinary discussion with some excellent panelists. So what I'd like to do is just start with a brief overview, so you know kind of the roadmap for where we're going today. We're going to talk really briefly about why we're doing this webinar, and we discussed it very slightly in our introductions. We're going to talk about what we know about children and youth and ALS, and spoiler alert, we don't know enough is what we should know. We're going to talk about existing programs and research addressing children and youth and ALS. Then we're going to close it out with a really powerful discussion about gaps and limitations and really positive next steps. Where can we go next as a society, really seeking to embrace and support and educate children and youth living in families with ALS or motor neuron? And then finally, we have time for some question and answers. So please don't hesitate, whatever question you might have, however complicated or simple or straightforward, please don't hesitate to put it in the chat box, because at the end I will be able to address as many as we possibly can. So to start out, why are we doing this webinar? What we know is that across the globe, families living with ALS very often include children and youth. And these can be an adult with their young child. This can be a grandparent with their grandchild, or any sort of family relation that has a child in the family or in the home. But what we also know is that the overwhelming majority of programs and services either target the person living with ALS or their adult caregiver. But what we do know is that this is changing as far as the age of individuals being diagnosed with ALS. We do understand that people being diagnosed with ALS are often younger and younger. Lots of individuals who have served in the military or athletes, and these are individuals that have children and youth in the home. And we know that lots of places around the world are really starting to grapple with this, and how do we develop supports and services. And through the amazing support of the International Alliance, they put us together to say, what do we know? How can we move forward? So what do we know? So we don't have any specific numbers because I am based in the US. I do know a little bit about what we understand in the US, but even that is woefully incomplete. The study that we conducted in 2015 estimated a third of adults living with ALS have a child or youth under the age of 18. And what we also know, not only in the US, but worldwide, children and families with illness, not only ALS, but because this is an ALS seminar, we're going to talk specifically about ALS, they are providing care. And often this care is daily and primary to that individual who's living with ALS. And the development and the need for support for these children and youth is so critical. And we're going to talk much more about that and the existing amazing programs throughout the world. And like I said a moment ago, younger and younger adults are being diagnosed with ALS. So the need for targeting programs for children and youth cannot be understated enough. And the last thing, because we are all still very much living under the shadow of the pandemic, the impact of COVID on children and youth cannot again be underscored enough. And that is, we truly are seeing children and youth, their caregiving responsibilities ramped up because they don't have outlets. They don't have those social supports and school and respite because of various lockdowns or concern about getting COVID themselves or their family member living with ALS who gets COVID. So while that's not the primary part of this discussion, we did not want to leave that under addressed because we're all still in this context of COVID and understanding how that is affecting our families and the role that children play as caregivers or simply supporting their adults is very much a part of that COVID experience. And the last thing I'd like to say is the following slides represent what we know and what the Alliance knows. And we are quite sure that there are many other programs, many other support services, many other anything out there for children and youth around the world living in families with ALS. And if there's one thing I can say, kind of a call for anything that you have is if you're part of an alliance, if you're part of a chapter, if you're part of an organization, let the Alliance know, because the best thing we can do is continue to compile all of this information and all of these supports and learn from each other and how these things can be adapted across cultures and societies and populations. So while we're going to be presenting what we know, we also know that there's a whole lot more out there, and we're very excited to learn what might exist in other countries and locations. So the first thing that we're going to talk about is the research that has been conducted on children and youth in families with ALS. And the first thing is we're going to start with the Europe and the UK. And as Laura mentioned earlier, the UK, through the MND Association, has really beefed up a lot of their programs and services for children and youth, after they conducted a scoping study to really understand what are the needs of children and youth in families living with ALS, and particularly what are those supports. And in just a few moments, Laura is going to go into the amazing programs that the UK and the MND Association have developed. Another area is in the Netherlands. And I know some amazing colleagues there who are really developing some research projects. Again, what are those support needs? How can the greater society, but also how can ALS professionals and clinicians provide the best quality of care for not only the person living with ALS, but that child or youth in the home and family. And they're also, and I'm thrilled because I'm a part of this second study, really understanding the role of self-compassion and reducing stigma in families living with ALS. And the next slide is obviously something I'm very passionate about, because this is the work that myself and my colleagues have done in the United States and South Africa. And we did a study in 2015, which was really the first study saying, what do we know about children and families with ALS? And we found a lot. And several of the areas we've been able to build on and conduct further research. And the first one is understanding that the overwhelming majority of children and youth and families with ALS have no training, they have no particular skill set, and yet they're deeply involved in care. And as a result, we have developed the Y-Care program, which is a multidisciplinary skills training support peer engaged program, which we'll talk about in a moment. But the second was, and you'll see in the top right-hand corner, children and youth and families with ALS aren't sleeping very well. And is that due to concern and worry? Is that due to overwhelming caregiving tasks? So what we set out to do is start to understand, what is that role of caregiving? What is that role of stress and anxiety in children and youth in ALS? And we've done one feasibility study where we found that children in families with ALS compared to non-ALS are not sleeping well. And lastly, in South Africa, through the most amazing colleagues in the MND Association down in South Africa, we have done an assessment of families. And then we have also started to develop the Y-Care program for the South African context, which is obviously quite different than the US context. So the next thing I want to make sure we spend lots of time on is really exploring the existing programs for children and youth. I'm going to turn this over to my colleague, Laura, and just a little caveat to say, any of you listening in any other countries or any locations, and you say, oh, hey, that's a really great program, please reach out to us, because the goal is to be able to share what we know and make it as widely accessible as possible. So Laura, I'm going to turn it over to you and let you discuss our programs for children and youth.
Oh, thank you, Melinda. And actually, I can't echo enough how about this webinar is about sharing knowledge, because we're very clear in the UK that our knowledge comes from the people which we serve, which is the community of MND. So without the worldwide knowledge and what's going on, we can't become better. And that's our aim, is to share our knowledge and deliver really good programs of work. So thank you, Melinda. And please, as she said, if anyone does have anything that they think would work, please send it in. We're all for learning, so please do. But I thought we'd just kick off with what's going on in the UK, and things have really gained impetus at the moment. We sort of made a change at the MND Association in about 2018-19 in a direct ask and response to families with MND asking us what we could do more for children and youth. They were quite clearly saying saying we need more from you as an association. We feel like you're meeting our healthcare needs and our physical needs are being met, but our emotional, psychological needs of ourselves and our families could do with some more work. So we sort of took that on board and we reflected and we said, where can we help? Like, what is our purpose in helping these families? So in 2019, as Melinda mentioned earlier, we took part in a scoping exercise just to clarify what the needs were of our audience and what these families wanted from us. There are obviously boundaries. We can't be everything that they need, but we wanted to make a start. So I travelled up and down the country, asking, completing questionnaires, completing focus groups with children and young people, completing focus groups with parents who'd got MND or who had a loved one with MND. And what we did, we put all that information together and made a list of pilot projects that we could test, because what we always wanted to be sure that it would be evaluated and it would be a process where we could say, actually, we tried that and it worked, or no, it didn't work, we need to focus our efforts on something else. But what we were clear was that it had to be based on the voice of the children affected by MND. So we started from a really nice place. We were very lucky and we got some funding from some fundraisers to do this. And what we then did, we pulled out the core bits of information that they said to us. So we pulled out the core bits, and mainly what the young children and people would say to me was they wanted to find ways to cope. So that was one of the things that they highlighted. They wanted a chance to make memories with their loved ones. They wanted some sort of counselling or therapeutic support, but maybe only for the top tier of children who were really struggling, because most of the young people would do okay. They just needed either some peer support or some mentoring and befriending to help them through their journey. That they wanted to give back or fundraise. That was something that always came out with young people, and it's usually around their coping of an uncontrollable disease that they have no control over, but that fundraising and giving back allowed them to do this. But they also said that they wanted to meet others, to have that commonality with others, but without having to explain their story over and over again. They didn't want to be the MND children, labelled as MND kids, but they wanted to be around others who knew what they were doing. So obviously we couldn't reach all on the first stage. So for the first year and a half, we trialled a few bits. So what we tried was, the first stab in the dark was our memory and treasure boxes. These are not a new idea. Lots of hospices, cancer support services will use a memory box. I'm sure most of you are aware, grieving usually starts with children whose loved ones have got MND at diagnosis, because that anticipatory grief can happen from the minute the diagnosis comes. So what we wanted to do was make a box that was more living, so living with, so to start at pre-diagnosis, so as close as we could get it to diagnosis as possible. And the aim of the boxes is it's not about memories, it's about creating memories while we're still able to, but not the big grandiose for us trips to Lapland or America or things like that. It was about these small treasured bits of information that have no relevance and don't seem important to families until you can no longer ask them, or until you're no longer able to find out what your grandparents' favourite floor cleaner was, because that smell reminds me of Nan, or what perfume she wears, or what's her favourite playlist, and what car did she drive. So there's some really cool creative activities in there to help start discussion. And the aim is to start that discussion with children and young people, which will allow families to expand discussion and talk about things that might develop. There is things in there like worry boxes. We do put a little guide in there. There's a teddy and a cuddly toy. There's pictures. We encourage people to do handwriting if they're still able to use their hands. There's nothing nicer for a young person than still seeing their loved one's handwriting or hearing their spoken voice. When I created the boxes, I created them with a mum of two young children, 5 and 7, whose husband was 38 and died within 3 months of MND. And what she said to me was, my world was falling apart and no one dared talk to me about what I should do with my children. And she said, I wished someone had control of me and said, Rachel, you need to do this with your kids. And it all started because her little girl asked her what Daddy's favorite ice cream was. And she said, although she had it, she didn't know what that ice cream was. So yeah, it's just a lovely way of doing it. We also have now a dedicated counselling service, because we recognise that we've got a top tier of young people who do need a bit more therapeutic counselling. And I'm not sure what waiting lists are like across the world, but some of our waiting lists for therapeutic counselling in the UK, especially in statutory services, can be quite long. MND always doesn't afford us time sometimes. So we needed a quicker access service. So we now have received funding, and we fund a service for 4 to 25-year-olds, ensuring that we can take into account them, the older teenagers, as I call them, or the older younger adults who may be leaving home, experiencing transitional change to university, and are worried about, should they leave, should they stay at home, is it guilty to leave their siblings to look after mum or dad. So the sessions are virtual. COVID has actually enabled us to deliver a virtual service. And the turnaround for access is about 5 days, which has been incredible. It means anyone who needs it can access the service. So that's a really lovely partnership that we now have. We also, prior to COVID, started to do some memory making events. And these we were hoping to do 8 per year. We only ran 3 because then COVID put the scuppers on that. But we're trying to do a mixture of child only events to put young people in touch with young people, to have fun, to be free from the constraints of MND, to be free from the caregiving responsibilities, even if only for an hour, but also to be able to access memories that they might not have been able to access. If their loved one, if the financial situation, or they're worried about leaving them, we enable the children to be able to access that. But we also run memory making days where families, parents and children are involved, so that the memories can be created as a whole family. We're also in the process of setting up a young adult carer group. And we specifically have gone for this age because we wanted that peer commonality together. So young people to support young people, go and give them a safe, open space to discuss what's going on, but in a very informal way. So it's not structured, but it's a safe space for them to talk, share, laugh, cry, shout, drink gin, whatever that may be. They're in that 18 to 25-year-old category. We also, our last bit that we've been working on is really increasing our literature and digital reach for younger children. So for younger children particularly, we wanted it to be much more creative, much more accessible, and much more appealing for the younger audience to understand the subtleties and small changes that may come on that journey of MND, but in a very safe way, but allowing children to play through games, through videos, things like we have jigsaw puzzles on there that just normalise things like an electric wheelchair that they're going to play snap with, or a non-invasive ventilation mask. Just things so they get to see what these bits of equipment might look like, what the hospital bed might look like, but in a very characteristic way. With that, we have a storybook, which has been lovely for our young children. It's like a bedtime storybook that we send out free to everyone, just subtly detailing some of the changes that MND might bring to the family, the big changes. The 3 we focused on are the eating, because young children tend to find when the feeding tube is fitted, they find that quite disturbing sometimes, or they're not sure how to use it or what that will mean for dinner anymore. So the story very safely goes through that. These are all free as well to our audience, so anybody in the UK can now access them. So we still have a long way to go, but I genuinely believe in the UK we are heading in the right way and we're moving in the right direction. So yeah, that's a bit of blurb about us. If any of you have any questions about what's going on, or like Melinda said, we're always open to share. I'm not precious. I will share everything that we've got, so please get in touch.
Thank you, Laura. That was a really wonderful detail about the UK. I'm gonna go through fairly quickly what we're doing here in the US. So the ALS Association, we have 40 some chapters. I apologize. I say we, I don't work for the association, but it's 40 some chapters across the US. And in almost all of the chapters, there are some form of youth programming, whether it's a support group or like what Laura was talking about, memory boxes, opportunities to learn more about ALS. But what we found in our initial research study, as I was saying before, is that children and youth are deeply involved in care. They don't have anyone who's teaching them what to do. They also don't know enough about the disease itself. And so what we find is that they were going on the internet and reading the most horrible end of life, thinking that that's exactly what ALS was. So we set out to do kind of two primary projects in collaboration with the ALS Association. And the first one is the Y Care program. And that's a multidisciplinary day-long program that gives children and youth and families with ALS the tools and the support and the education to be able to do the tasks that they're already doing. So this is like, how do you really help someone in and out of a chair? How do you help them kind of transfer using a board? What's a gait belt? You know, those kinds of things. And they're all taught by clinicians in a variety of our ALS clinics. So these are PTs, OTs, speech language pathologists, social workers, neurologists. And it's in a peer engaged environment, because the second biggest thing we found is that youth don't know how to talk to other youth about either their parent with an illness or caregiving. And this is a day-long program that has them meet other kids and families with ALS. They learn what is ALS from the neurologist, and then they learn how best to help their family member living with ALS. And the second primary thing we did is we wrote a series of books, because this was very, very clear. There were no educational materials for children and youth and young adults. There were no specific educational materials for families, because the question we got a lot is, how do I talk about it? What do I say? How is my kid going to respond to it? So we wrote a whole series of books based on these research interviews. And all these books represent real children. It's their real voices and their real stories. And there's a series that start with children as young as 7 all the way up to 25 and 30. We also have a family book that really helps families digest the developmental stages and when it's good to talk and what it's good to say. So these books are widely available, just like what Laura was saying. They're fully available. They're online through the ALS Association. You can get a PDF copy. You can order a hard copy. We'll talk about it in a second, but they've been translated to German, French, and Italian. They're in the process of being translated to Dutch. So, you know, these are really important tools that didn't exist, but are now out there and available to anyone who would like a copy. And the other thing, not through the ALS Association, but there's an organization called Hope Loves Company. And it was started by a woman who had lost her husband at a very young age with ALS, and she had a young child. And it's an organization that provides a lot of support for kids and families with ALS, but its primary role is to create camps. So they have respite camps in several locations throughout the US, giving kids an opportunity to still be a kid and talk about ALS and talk about their family and friends. So those are just a small snapshot of the things we're doing in the US, and I'm going to turn it back over to Laura.
Thank you, Melinda. So I'm just going to give a quick whistle-stop tour of what's going on in the rest of Europe. Melinda might jump in if she's got any additional knowledge on there, but she tells me that the Netherlands are doing some wonderful things for families and really growing this side of their work. So they've developed a guide for families on how to support their children, and it was based on the guide Families and ALS. So how do we talk with children? How do we support them? Linking with that, they've also developed the guide for care professionals, and we're seeing this a lot, how good it is for professionals to be able to understand how to support children who might be affected by MND and ALS, and how they as a professional, if they don't understand the disease, can get an understanding of what is their role in supporting that child. And these have been developed in close collaboration with a working group including ALS care professionals, ALS patients, relatives, researchers. So their grounding is from a really good base point, and they really understand the needs of these families and how we can best support them. What they've also done that Melinda tells me is just a fabulous piece of work is Luca and the Lights. And this is a short silent film about representing the changes and the ALS progression of a person, but through a very creative sort of visual process. What she says is basically Luca loses his lights as the MND progresses. The short film is for all ages, and there's no language requirement, so it's very accessible to all, and it's just a really lovely way of explaining some of the changes that may come on the MND ALS journey. As Melinda mentioned also, a lot of these books, publications and literature have been translated into different formats and into different languages, so they are becoming more widely accessible. They're also, most of them are accessible in hardback, but also, as Melinda said, PDF, and we can get them to you in most formats. So please get in touch if you do need them. Melinda, is there anything there that I've not covered?
No, that was excellent. Well done, Laura.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right, so we'll switch it over now to Marcela, who's going to give us really some wonderful information about what's going on in Colombia. And what we recognize is that there are so many places around the world that we don't know a lot about. So we are thrilled to have Marcela provide us some information about Colombia.
Thank you, Melinda and Laura, for those excellent resources that you have provided to the whole alliance. I think it's very helpful, especially for countries like Colombia right now, which we have few or basically no information about children with ALS, because first of all, we don't have the metrics of who they are, how are they doing, how many there are. So that's been really difficult, especially because before, like 10 years before, it was basically patients that have 60 or 70 years old. So they had no children, like youth from teenage years or youth, it was just adults. Now, like Melinda said at the beginning, we've beginning to see a lot of new young patients or younger patients, which means they have young children. So it has been a real challenge for us to know this. But specifically because in the Colombian context, because it is a male-dominated culture, the person that cares, it's usually a woman. So that means even if it's a girl, if it's a 12-year-old girl, 8-year-old girl, she will be in charge of bathing, taking care of feeding, doing all the home responsibilities with the patients, which is really hard on those girls because it's changing their life project. So, and on the other side, what we've seen is the boys or the male children or youth, they are just used sorry to say the word, to make like to use force to move the patient from a position to another because they have the strength to do that. But in no emotion, no caring, and being like with the patient 24/7, like with women or children. The other thing we have seen is, and it's really sad, it's because of our context here in Colombia, some adolescents have been trying to avoid and escape the reality they're in with facing ALS, and their coping mechanism is not to cope. So basically they just escape, and maybe no, I've seen that they have been hanging out with the wrong crowd, doing drug abuse, which of course does not help the support system, and it doesn't help the patient as well. So what I encourage my patients is, the PALS children's, is to talk about how they're feeling, and also open up the ability to express emotion, because we are in a country where males specifically are not expected to share their emotions. So I've emphasized a lot, but I emphasize even more, if you're seeing that in your country or wherever you are in the world, just allow the children to talk about their feelings. And it's okay to be bad, it's to feel bad about it. It doesn't make you wrong. It's I would be shocked if I see a child that's happy about their dad having ALS, you know. So just open that space up. I have not found a family where everybody takes care of the patient equally, and that's okay. What we have to do is take the skills of every person and use that in our advantage, you know. Some people are really good in finance, keeping the bills paying. Another children are really good at cooking, and others are really good at entertaining the parent. So we should use those skills in our advantage for the whole support system to be good. And that takes us to the gaps and the cultural, the gaps and implications and next steps for these changes. Of course, in Colombia, the first thing that we need to know is who are these children, and or not just Colombia, the whole world. We need to know who they are, how many they are, how they're doing. So the easiest way to do that is, if you have an ALS patient in any clinic, in any office, in any chapter of your association, ask them if there are children in the family. Ask them their age, ask them how they're doing, how they're coping with it. We have to focus on the whole family, not just the patient, because ALS, it's something a volunteer of ALS Association in Colombia says, is ALS doesn't pick people, it picks families. So we have to treat them as a whole. The other thing we have seen is there's a lack of patience in general, not just for the patients with ALS, but also for the children with ALS. So we have to be careful about when the parent is giving a child a task, a caregiving task. It has to be really well defined. It cannot be I don't know, cook dinner. It has to be, okay, let's do this for dinner. The meat has to I don't know, be defrozen, and then we have to do this. Like, be task oriented with the children, because if you give them a big task, a general task, they'll probably just be frustrated and not do it. So just be very task oriented when asking for the children to do something for you. Like I said, we need to assess the cultural needs and implications. For example, like I said, in Colombia, we have a drug abuse in adolescents. So we have to take care of that and offer the children the help they need for that. But it's not just in Colombia. Every culture has a different implications. We need to adjust the programs and the services for those specific needs. I don't know what, wait a second. I have a lot of notes about this. Also, where do we go from here? I think it's really important to translate and adapt all those resources that Melinda and Laura have shown us, because it's super important to have guidelines for family members, especially how to talk about children about ALS. From my personal experience, it was super hard, because my parents just gave me like a basic information, and internet exists, you know. So the children will automatically go to Google. I have a patient that didn't tell her daughter, and the daughter is 13 years old, and she started seeing that her mom was getting worse. She has bulbar onset, and she just Googled Riluzole or Rilutec on Google, and she found out the mom's disease and read a lot of things online. Not a children specific children language of ALS, you know, just like what you get on Google when you search ALS or MND. So in order to prevent that, just open up the space for children to talk about ALS openly. And also we need to adapt, as I said, the resources to talk about ALS in a language that children will understand and will not panic if they go to Google. So basically, that's also something about the difficulty with diagnosis. Here in Colombia, we've been getting patients that take 1 year to be diagnosed, specifically because of the pandemic. Last year, a lot of patients didn't go to the doctor, so they just like waited it out. And now they get, at the end of 2020 is when they get the diagnosis. So that difficulty with diagnosis is also increases the anxiety of the whole family, because they don't know what it is, what's going on. And that's even harder than getting diagnosis, not knowing. So that, and then when you get the diagnosis, it's the anticipatory grief that Laura was talking about, and how the family is actually coping with it. So that differs from cultures and countries. Like I said, here it's been taking a year or so to get diagnosis. So that's been really hard on families. And next slide. I know, sorry, I forgot I had to do a closing statement. So never mind.
Oh no, you know what? We actually have a few more minutes before we go to Q&A. But if you wanted to say something else, please. You said you had a closing statement. You wanted to?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that ALS is not all bad for children and youth. You know, I think it gives them the right tools to be independent, to be problem solvers, to be empathetic with other people with any disability or any difference or or disease. So I think we need to look at the bright scope of it, not just like the bad thing, but I think it has helped a lot of children to mature enough and be able to solve even bigger problems along their lives.
Well said. Well said, Marcela. Thank you. I think that a huge key takeaway there, and I loved so much all of the detail that both Marcela, but particularly Laura gave about the programs is, you know, and we found the same thing here in the US. You know, these children and youth, they just need to be supported and they need to be heard. So regardless of whether, you know, you're in a country where you feel like, oh, we don't have all of these resources, you know, please reach out to us. We will share anything and everything we have. And actually in the chat, there are links to the MND Buddies Web Hub and Storybook. There's a link to the YCare program, which we can adapt and provide to any location, any country, any language. And then also all the books for children and youth and families. And I forgot to mention, we also have one for school personnel, because that was also a huge issue. Children and youth were falling asleep in class and really struggling. And a lot of the school personnel didn't have either the information or knowledge about ALS to know how to support them, but also there was an assumption that there was something kind of bad. And I think I bring that up to follow up on what Marcela is saying is, you know, there's so many positives when kids are engaged and when kids understand and they can be a part of those discussions, but they need that support and they need that acknowledgement. So whether you have this huge toolbox or not, anything you can do in your location, in your organization to just acknowledge that kids exist in these families and how can you support them, and use all of us and every tool we have. We will share anything and everything, because that is the goal, is to make sure that these children and youth don't continue to be missed. Was that your hand, Laura?
Sorry.
Yeah.
Melinda, sorry, what I just wanted to say as well is also that we had sort of a bit of a culture shift within the United Kingdom where we were so used to focusing on the person with MND, and what we wanted to do was holistically then focus on the whole family. And some people found that adjustment not easy. You know, they were kept saying, well, should we be spending our money on the sibling or the niece or nephew? And actually I had a really powerful conversation with a person living with MND, a parent, and what they said was exactly what I said earlier. Although they have got MND or ALS, they are still primarily a parent. And they felt like MND had taken away their ability to parent. So what we had to do was help them acknowledge that they still were that parent, and help them. What we found was actually a way of explaining to others who were unsure of why we supported the family as a whole and why we took that holistic approach was that person with MND. I'll never forget, a young gentleman said to me, I feel really well supported, Laura. I don't want MND. I don't want to die of MND, but I've got it, and I accept my diagnosis now, and I accept that I've got good care. I might have had to fight for a bit of access to it, but I've got it now, and I feel supported. Mm-hmm. However, my biggest fear in life is what's going to happen to my kids. Don't worry about me anymore, worry about them. And I'm not saying that we don't just worry about the person with MND. I'm just saying for us to help that person with MND, we sometimes have to help that family. One of my AVs, my visitors, said to me one time, we need to think of everyone. That might even be the cat, because if the cat is important to that person with MND, then that's who we should be taking into account. I'm not comparing kids and cats, but you get what I'm saying. It just needs to be a whole person-centered approach. And sometimes to help that person with MND, the best thing we can do is to help their families. So so that's where we're heading. I hope so.
Yes, Marcella?
I was going to say that I've seen that where patients become patients, and the family members don't see them as parents anymore. So they start to be invisibilized, or like not taken in account when asking for permission, when they're asking what to do, where to go. And that needs to shift back to they're still parents, and they still have to be heard, you know, even if they're not talking. There's a lot of ways to communicate. We have seen that in ALS. So the other parent or the other family members need to give importance to that voice. It's super, super important. I remember when my dad was sick, I was 14 years old, and then my brother 16, my sister 18. And then when my brother got to senior year, he got a scholarship to go study abroad to the US. And he got this scholarship, and he started like being in shock and crying. And I was like, why are you happy? And he said, I don't know, am I supposed to go or stay? Like, should I stay here with my dad because he's dying, you know? He ended up living 16 years. So we all graduated from high school, MBA, whatever, you know? But and when he approached my dad, he was like, I got the scholarship, what should I do? My dad said some words that have marked my life. And he said, I'm the one who's sick, not you. You go live your life. Just keep me updated and send me photos. That's it, you know? And it was beautiful because he was like, you don't have to stop your life project because I'm sick, you know? And there are many other ways to support pals from abroad or by being far, just calling them, video chatting, helping with finance, sending emails, you know? There's a lot of things you can do by being far, and that's also caregiving. So I just wanted to validate that for everybody that's listening and have the children in this kind of state right now.
I can't say enough about how excellent this advice is, because we have a couple questions in chat, but I just wanted to follow up because this has come up over many years of my clinical practice, but also in my research. And we assume that children are always going to, and I'm using that word kind of broadly, that they're going to respond as a child. But the truth is, many, many, many of the children and youth in our families with ALS have a very adult perspective, and they can step outside themselves and think about the adult in that very kind of caregiver mindset. So it's not surprising that your brother would say, oh, you know, should I not do this? Because he has that empathy and that ability to step outside and say, no, I'm concerned about you. And I think that we don't always give children and youth the credit for having that perspective and that ability to have that perspective. And it's interesting to me because I think it goes in line. We have a question that says, why has there been reluctance by healthcare professionals in the past to acknowledge children? And I think it's multiple fold, and I certainly want to hear from my colleagues. I'll just say two things briefly. One, I think we still are under the assumption that ALS is an older person's disease, and increasingly it's not. Two, in the US, I'll speak from the US perspective, we have that immediate expectation that a child shouldn't be told all of this. The child's not going to understand it anyway. And they need to be kind of removed from that situation. And I think that all of those things are not particularly fair to the child or to the adult in that situation. So I think that we've commented in many different ways. Anytime you have the opportunity to educate a healthcare professional about the importance of engaging the children and youth, please take it. And oftentimes it's based in just, I've never worked with kids. I don't really know what to say. I don't understand how to engage with them. Well, that's a really good opportunity for your organization, your chapter, your alliance to really develop relationships and help educate and train those healthcare professionals. But I'll open it up to Laura and Marcella if you wanted to answer that question about why there's been such a reluctance for healthcare professionals to engage kids.
I just wanted to add that here in Colombia, we don't have ALS clinics. So it's just like any clinic is treating ALS. So professionals barely know how to take care of ALS patients. And they don't even know like how to treat children of a patient with ALS, you know? So I think it's just fear of doing it wrong. So they just don't engage. I personally think that's the issue here.
So there's another question that has come in that says, are there different approaches in different cultures, right? So what are the different approaches across different cultures? I'll just speak really briefly to my colleagues in South Africa, and that one of the things we found is that the maybe lack of understanding or lack of knowledge about what ALS is and how it's affecting the family is deeply embedded in cultural, spiritual, religious belief systems and understandings. So how to go about working with these families truly requires a solid understanding of not only just cultural differences, but kind of spiritual, that things might be caused by something in the spiritual realm, rather than kind of, we don't know why you get this disease. And so that's a tiny piece of understanding across different cultures, that oftentimes it's influenced by spirituality, religiosity, and kind of cultural expectations and norms. So that's just I'll introduce that. And certainly Laura and Marcella, do you have anything you want to add about the different approaches and different cultures, and maybe what we need to understand about that culture before we just kind of dive in and say, fix this?
I think probably Marcella touched on it quite a lot when she spoke about the difference in Colombia and the approach of the different caregiving needs. But I think obviously we're in the UK, we're probably not as diverse as Marcella was speaking about. We don't have them sort of difficulties, say, of caregiving responsibilities. But what we are finding is we have populations who won't reach us as an association, who don't think we have a service to offer us. And what we're trying to do is adapting our reach so that we do it at appropriate times that are accessible to all and in languages that are accessible to all, because we have silos of sort of geographical areas where we're just not seeing the reach we're getting there, and we're recognizing that it's us that's the problem. It's the way we're not reaching them in the right format at the right times through the clinics. We have lots of Jewish communities who will only go to clinic at a certain time. They will not go at others. And we were running support groups at completely the wrong times for them. You know, they were never going to come to them. And it's taken us a lot of learning to acknowledge that and be brave enough to say, right, we do need to adapt our practice. So I think it's happening. It's probably not happening as quick as it should, but it's very at the forefront of our thinking of adapting our services to meet the needs.
And you do wonder, because I don't know who all is on this call or who will be watching this eventually, but I know that there are a lot of areas of the world that have few services, that have very little financial support and funding. And so we think about kind of those cultural implications. it's also has to do with access and, the ability to even provide any sort of service, and I recognize that the majority of the continent of Africa is literally unclear about how many people are living with ALS, how many people are managing it, what sort of services. And so I think there's a difference in, if you have the ability to provide services, how are you adapting those and being as culturally cognizant as possible to make sure that they're done in the right language and in the right time. But also for all of us, I think it behooves all of us to think about what about the rest of the world and what are those implications and how can we build those connections to even just provide the basic access and care. So that's my tiny little soapbox. Marcella, did you want to add something to that? Okay. Nope. We had one other question. So we just have about 5 more minutes. I think we've somewhat addressed this, but I'm going to put it out there for you both. We can all think about it. It's asking for all 3 speakers to give their top 3 tips on what to do with children living in ALS. And so we have 5 minutes. So maybe let this be like a speed round of your top 3 tips on what to do with children. Laura, it looks like you wanted to start.
Yeah, I'll start. My first one would be to treat each family as an individual that has differing needs. So no family will ever be the same. So to acknowledge and recognize that. My next one would be to be brave enough to talk to the children about MND, but also to take support in doing that if you have the luxury of having a support service to do that, to explore your fears, worries, hopes, dreams about what that information will do to your child, sort of what that will mean, and also providing a safe space for that young person to speak about MND or ALS. But that doesn't always mean it might not be the parent. It could be the teacher, it could be a schoolmate, it could be the lady that lives down the road, but just allowing them to have that space. And one more is just allowing them to still be children, to still function in that family as a child or as a young person. And I think, yeah, I'm just recognizing that you're all wonderful and you're all doing a good job, but you will get there. So yeah, they're my tips.
Nice. Thank you, Laura. Marcella?
I think Laura just said everything I wanted to say, but yeah, I would say tip number 1, open communication. Just talk about ALS. You should be a safe space. A lot of families I've seen, they don't talk about the pink elephant in the room, which is ALS. So just talk about it openly, about fears, about, for example, in my case, my fear was that my dad wouldn't be at my wedding. So what I did was I took control. And he wrote words for me to read on my wedding day. That's a way to take control of the now. So yeah, open communication. Second, don't assume the children will not understand ALS or will not be able to care for you. Just ask them how they feel, how are they feeling, what are their abilities, what are their skills. And third, encourage the children to seek help in other spaces, not just in their families, with their peers at school, with psychologists, with other PALS children, but encourage them to seek help.
Absolutely. Oh, you guys are amazing. The only word I could think of was listen, and listen to the children. And we don't, I think as a society, as a whole, do a good enough job of just letting them explain and explore and express. And that is what families have told me over the years. And as a clinical social worker, let them tell you, let them express, even if it's hard to hear. And I think that's another thing that sometimes as adults, it's hard to hear a child be upset or angry or thrilled or whatever it is. Let them tell you and really listen to them and let them feel like their voice is being heard, which is just so critical. So we are at time, which is shocking. I can't thank, I mean, what an amazing presenter group. Thank you, ladies, for your brilliance, your work with children and youth. And thank you so much to the Alliance for giving us this platform. And for everybody listening, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. I should have had this up a long time ago. My apologies. Here's our contact slide. There's information in the web chat for any of our resources. Here's all of our emails. Please take a screenshot, write it down, do whatever you need. We are very happy to share. I can't thank you all enough. It's truly an honor. I'm going to turn it over to Kathy, who is just going to do some very quick closing remarks. So again, thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Melinda. And for those who don't know this, today is the WHO's International Youth Day, which is why we chose to do this seminar on this particular day. So I want to say a huge thank you to Melinda, Marcella, and Laura for bringing their diverse experiences from around the globe to this particular topic. Despite the fact that they are diverse experiences, I think there's a lot of universal commonality that we've heard in the webinar today. And again, a huge thank you to Melinda, Marcella, and Laura for bringing their perspectives. Again, I want to thank Biogen for sponsoring our webinar series so that we're able to bring these each month to screens around the world. And we have also streamed this live on Facebook. So you can watch it in archive on Facebook and also on our website in about 24 hours. So thank you everyone for joining us today. Enjoy the rest of your day or evening as the case may be. And we will reconnect again in the future. Thank you.